Everybody. So I'm really appreciative of everything that's been done. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to tell you to make sure you get a flyer about the Sudan Summit coming up in March. If you're interested in attending that at George Mason University, Arlington campus, March 10th and 11th, you can sign up online for that at actforsudan.org. We're having Debbie speak about the Organization on Islamic Cooperation today, and Deborah Weiss works for Vigilance, an organization dedicated to educating the public on terrorism-related issues. She was a counsel for the Committee on House Oversight in Congress, and she also was an assistant corporation counsel in Mayor Gilani's administration. Ms. Weiss is considered an expert in the defamation of religion resolutions. Some of you know what that means. Others of you will find out very soon and have a rude awakening as to what that's talking about. And is a contributing author to a book called Saudi Arabia and the Global Islamic Terrorist Network. She contributes to Front Page Magazine and the Washington Times and other publications. And to me, one of the striking things about Deborah is that she's a survivor of 9/11 in New York City. Some of us think we may have been survivors thanks to the plane that went down in Pennsylvania, because we were at the Rayburn House office building on 9/11. Anybody want to raise their hand who was with me at the Sudan briefing? Jimmy Mullah was there. But Deborah could tell you about what it was like to experience 9/11 in New York. And maybe that added to her awareness of what's going on today. But I want to turn it over to Deborah now. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank IRD for holding this event, and I want to thank Mark and Faith for inviting me to speak here today, and for all of you for taking time out of your day to educate yourselves on this important topic. I'm going to talk to you about the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and their UN resolutions to combat defamation of religions, and why there's still need for you as Christians to be concerned. So first, who is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or the OIC? It's the second largest international organization in the world, behind only the UN. It's the largest Islamic organization in the world, claiming to represent 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. It's comprised of 56 UN member states, plus the Palestinian Authority, and they tend to vote together as a bloc in the UN. They're absolutely the largest voting bloc in the Human Rights Council, and arguably the largest voting bloc in the UN as a whole. Previously, they were called the Organization for Islamic Conference, if you want to Google more information about them. And in 2011, they changed their name to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, but their mission remains identical to what it was previously, so I'll let you decide whether or not they're cooperating, and if so, with whom. The OIC holds itself out as a moderate organization, but in fact it's an Islamist supremacist organization whose long-term vision is the worldwide implementation of Sharia law. Its highest priorities are is the supremacy of Islam and what's in the best interest of the Islamic Ummah. It's a community mentality that's totally at odds with Western notions of individual freedom and individual rights. It's within this framework, through the lens of Sharia law, that all ideas that are set forth by the OIC must be analyzed. The OIC's goal at the moment is to internationally criminalize all criticism of Islam, Muslims, Islamic theocracies, and even Islamic terrorism. The OIC uses primarily legal instruments to achieve its goals, such as UN resolutions and EU parliamentary legislation, as well as multilateral and international conferences. It presents the language in a watered-down form in order to achieve its goals gradually and incrementally. Under the guise of responsible speech, sensitive speech, or politically correct speech, what the OIC really wants to do is to stifle your freedom of speech. The first resolution I'm going to discuss with you today is called Combating Defamation of Religions. I'll just call it Defamation of Religions for short. Originally, this resolution was titled Defamation of Islam, but when it failed to get sufficient support, they changed the name. The resolution takes numerous assumptions and asserts them as fact. Without any hearings, without any debate, and without any investigation, the resolution asserts that Islam is wrongly associated with human rights violations, that it's wrongly associated with terrorism, and that there's been undue backlash against Muslims ever since 9/11. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept of combating defamation of religions, what it does is it takes an idea or a religion, in this case Islam, and gives it protection from criticism, as opposed to what we have in the American legal system, which gives defamation protections to an individual or group of individuals. So you have defamation of an idea or a religion versus defamation of people. Additionally, in the American legal system, in order for a comment to be defamatory, it has to be a false statement of fact. Truth is a defense. So if you say something bad about somebody, no matter how terrible it is, if it's true or mere opinion, it's not defamation. By stark contrast, the OIC's definition of defamation includes anything that sheds a negative light on Islam or Muslims, even if it's true and even if it's opinion. Taking that a step further, it also includes anything that would violate Islamic blasphemy codes. For example, in Islam, it's prohibited to draw depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. If you do that, even if you show him in a positive light, that's blasphemy in Islam, and the OIC would consider it defamation as well. On the other hand, if you're Christian and you say, I believe in the divinity of Jesus, then that can be considered blasphemy, and under a broad construction of this resolution, the OIC could deem it defamation also. And though the resolution is called defamation of religions, in the OIC's interpretation and implementation, it applies only to Islam. There is absolutely no reciprocity for anti-Jewish, anti-Christian, anti-Israel, or anti-Baha'i hate speech. In fact, the OIC supports Hamas, it supports Iran's nuclear program, and it rationalizes 9/11. UN resolutions are not legally binding, but they do make a political statement of support for the ideas embodied in the resolution. So if the resolution is passed repeatedly, then the political statement is given more weight. If it's passed in numerous bodies and over a long period of time, it runs the risk of eventually being deemed customary international law. Were that to happen, countries that are not signatories to the resolution could be pressured to adhere to it. This resolution was initially introduced into the UN into what was called the Commission on Human Rights in 1999. Later, it was introduced into the General Assembly in 2005. In 2005, the Commission on Human Rights folded and popped back up under the new name Human Rights Council, or HRC for short. It was introduced there in 2006. This resolution passed every single year in all three of those bodies since its initial introduction, all the way through and including 2010. 2008 was the first year that there was any chance that this resolution might not pass. It was in jeopardy. But the OIC launched a very aggressive Islamophobia campaign to make sure that it would. And I'm telling you all this background so that you'll understand what the implications are now. I'm giving you the background. So it held 2 summits on Islamophobia, where it established the existence of Islamophobia and said that they were going to have a zero tolerance for it. They were going to defend themselves against all free expression that they deemed to be Islamophobic, including hostile glances. And they were planning to target cartoonists, film producers, reporters, and governments. The second thing they did was they unveiled their first OIC Observatory report on Islamophobia. This consisted of 58 pages of real, imagined, claimed, or feigned Islamophobic incidents around the world. That report is now produced annually, and they also have a monthly bulletin. No, they have an annual report, and they also have a monthly bulletin on Islamophobia as well. So, by the way, the media often takes the statistics that are provided in these bulletins and repeats them without checking into the nature of the claims. And the numbers alone can seem very alarming. And they do that for other Islamophobia tracking organizations as well. So I'm going to give you a few examples of the types of things that the OIC considers Islamophobic. And this was taken, I think, from the February bulletin of that year. In 2008, in the country of Qatar, the first Christian church was erected. Muslims protested, and Arabic papers all around the country wrote articles about why Christians should not have the right to build a house of worship in a Muslim-majority country. One English language publication translated that article, one of the articles, and that republishing was Islamophobic. It was Islamophobic that, I'm not making this up, you could go look in the bulletin, that one was from February 2008. It's Islamophobic that Wikipedia refused to remove from their English language website depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. That was Islamophobic. And it's Islamophobic that the EU asked Iran to drop the death penalty for the crime of apostasy. The OIC repeatedly asserts that Islamophobia is one of the greatest threats to world peace and global security, rather than concluding that perhaps Islamophobia is the result of the actions taken by a radical Islamist movement around the globe. As a result of this victimhood campaign, the resolution passed yet again in 2008, although this time with declining support. Shortly thereafter, the Human Rights Council in the UN passed a rule that said nobody can come before this body and, quote, judge or evaluate a religion. The International Humanist Ethical Union came before the body asking them to consider the fact that there's violence against women in Iran. The examples they used included stonings against women and forced marriages of little girls, sometimes as young as age 9. They were told that these practices are permissible under Sharia law and that they cannot discuss it because to do so would be to judge or evaluate a religion. So it appears that any human rights violations that are permissible under Sharia law can no longer be addressed in the Human Rights Council, the body that was purportedly designed to address human rights. At a certain point, the State Department realized that this resolution had potentially dire consequences for freedom of speech. So in 2011, it asked the OIC to draft an alternative resolution that would both retain free expression and still address the OIC's concerns about alleged Islamophobia. The result was Resolution 1680. How does the resolution define religious profiling? It is, quote, the invidious use of religion as a criterion for purposes of searches, investigations, questioning, and interrogations. So notice, it's not prohibiting religion as the sole criteria. Nobody's saying, oh, you're Muslim, let's lock you up, and that's what this is prohibiting. Nobody wants to do that. This is saying you can't use religion as one factor on a list of other things to consider. The second thing, and pay attention to my language, is it condemns, quote, the advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to the incitement of discrimination, hostility, or violence, unquote, and urges states to take effective action against it. So, first, advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to hostility. You might have noticed that comes very close to outlawing hatred, which is an emotion. Second, this resolution, as with the former resolution, attempts to internationalize the norms of free speech. In America, we have the First Amendment governing our free speech rules. Other sovereign countries have their own rules governing speech. Both of these resolutions aspire to supplant those sovereign rules and replace it with one single rule across the board. Additionally, there's ample reason to believe that in the OIC's interpretation, any criticism of Islam would constitute the advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to the incitement that's condemned in this resolution. The third clause I want to draw your attention to, and this is the one that gets the most attention, is it calls for the criminalization of the imminent incitement to violence. So what's wrong with that? America has laws now that prohibit the imminent incitement to violence. Well, as it turns out, the OIC has a totally different interpretation of the word incitement. In America, we use what's called a content-based test, and the OIC wants a consequence-based test. So, for example, if I say to you, I hate Joe, and I want you all to get together tomorrow at 2 o'clock and kill him, and then you all do that, you will be responsible for murder, and I will be responsible for my comments, because the content of my language encouraged or incited the violence. That's a content-based test. On the other hand, the OIC wants a consequence-based test, and the example they use most frequently is that of the Danish cartoons. If you recall, in 2006, there was a series of depictions of cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. Subsequently, riots ensued all across Europe, all across the Middle East. The Danish embassies were trashed, people were killed, and mayhem ensued. The OIC would say that those riots were the consequence of the cartoons. But I think you'll agree with me when I say that while those riots were subsequent, there was nothing inherently consequent about it. If you have the Judeo-Christian values of personal responsibility, where does the responsibility lie? Does it lie with the person who commits the violence, or does it lie with the person who happens to make an offensive comment? There are a lot of problems with the consequence test, as you might have noticed. First is it shifts the responsibility. Oh, and I want to compare it also to how did Christians respond when they had that artwork of the cross put in urine. Or in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, they had a painting of the Virgin Mary with cow dung thrown on it. And that whole case went to the Giuliani Corporation Counsel's office also when I was there. Christians didn't go around committing violence and killing people and rioting. They wrote letters to the editor, they wrote op-eds, and they contacted Mayor Giuliani asking him not to support the Brooklyn Museum with taxpayer dollars. So this resolution, this interpretation of the consequence test shifts the responsibility from the violent actor to the person who just happens to make an offensive comic cartoon, film, or whatever. The other thing about it is it's a retroactive law. Your words, comments, cartoons, or films are totally legal until later on somebody chooses to respond to them in a violent manner, and then retroactively your comment was criminal. But most importantly, in effect, using the consequence test has the effect of enforcing the concept of combating defamation of Islam, the exact concept that this resolution was purportedly designed to defeat. It's also important to note that in the OIC's definition of Islamophobia is anybody who defames Islam. Anybody who defames Islam is an Islamophobe. So you can see from the overly broad definition that they have of defamation that they also have an overly broad definition of the word Islamophobia. It connotes much more than the American notion of mere bigotry or prejudice. So in combating intolerance or Islamophobia, pursuant to Resolution 1618, you're really protecting much more than Muslims. You're protecting Islam as well. And the other thing is they're always trying to equate Islamophobia with racism, sexism, and the like, and saying all of that is intolerant. The resolution replaces the defamation of religion's language, but the OIC has made it very clear that it has not dropped its goal to combat defamation of Islam. So I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about the Istanbul Conference. All right, so what is the Istanbul process? The Istanbul process is the implementation, it's the process of implementing Resolution 1618 in order to make it a reality. Despite the fact that there is absolutely nothing in the resolution that mandates this, and it's contrary to leaving UN resolutions in the norm of the theoretical. In July of 2011, the OIC held its first implementation meeting in Istanbul, Turkey. Thus, it's called the Istanbul Conference. Hillary Clinton attended that meeting, and while she was there, she announced to the world that the State Department would hold the second Istanbul Conference in America. The fact that she announced this legitimized the OIC's positions, and it also signaled to the free world that partnering with the OIC is not only acceptable, but perhaps even desirable. And following, the EU used to hold the OIC at arm's length, but following America's lead, it did hold the third Istanbul Conference this past December in 2012. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what transpired at the U.S. State Department meeting. This meeting was held in December of 2011. It was a three-day meeting, three-day conference of meetings that were held primarily behind closed doors. Approximately 30 countries and international organizations attended, including the EU and the OIC. The OIC made it very clear that its goal for the conference was to push for speech-restrictive measures that would, on Islam-related topics. And while Hillary Clinton stated after the passage of Resolution 1618 that this means that we've, quote, begun to overcome the false divide that pits religious sensitivities against freedom of expression, unquote. So if she did have a concern about retaining free expression before the resolution, and I believe she did, then somehow by the time that the conference came around, the entire focus moved from protecting freedom of speech to protecting religious minorities. More specifically, the focus was on protecting Muslims in America and in the West, as opposed to protecting the truly persecuted religious minorities in the OIC countries. As you probably all know, the Coptic Christians in Egypt have been persecuted for eons, and now there's a virtual genocide against them. Are there any Jews in Saudi Arabia? I don't know, but if there are, they're denied citizenship. Islam and the Saudi Arabia government's interpretation of Islam is the only legal religion to practice in Saudi Arabia. In Iran, Baha'is are denied education and government benefits. They're completely treated as second-class citizens. And in Pakistan, it's actually a crime to practice your faith. If you're an Ahmadiyya Muslim, you will get jailed. But that was not the focus. It was the Muslims in America and the West, which obviously are fairly free and equal. And though Hillary Clinton said that she was not going to push for the enactment of speech restrictive laws, such as the European hate speech style laws, and she extolled the virtues of free speech, she quickly followed it up by saying that, quote, the U.S. advocates for other measures to achieve the same result, unquote. Those other measures included interfaith dialogue and, quote, the good old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming, unquote. Hillary Clinton seems to have a fundamental misunderstanding of the principles underlying the First Amendment. The First Amendment was designed to encourage robust political debate and to flesh out minority viewpoints. It wasn't intended for some people to use their free speech rights to tell other people to shut up, because that's a more effective means of silencing them than using speech restrictive laws. I assume that most of you in this audience support the notion of free speech. But even if you don't, is it the proper notion, the proper role of the State Department to use peer pressure and shaming to stifle the speech of Americans with whom it disagrees? No, I think not. Hillary Clinton says that she wants to, quote, bridge the divide that separates different faiths and different cultures. The problem is the bridge of tolerance flows in only one direction, toward the Islamization of the West and the ever-shrinking of free expression. Many people believe that this will never be a problem in America because we have the First Amendment, and certainly we're not going to lose our First Amendment freedoms tomorrow. But if you look around the globe and throughout history, freedom is the exception, it's not the rule, and we tend to take it for granted. The process of losing freedom can occur slowly and gradually. It's not always in a violent coup. If the public is not made aware of the threat to freedom and can't name it by name, then by the time they wake up, it might be too late. So I'm going to briefly go over with you what I see the process of losing our free speech rights. First, the OIC will always say we should have responsible speech. Free speech comes with duties, so we'll say we have to have sensitive speech, politically correct speech, or responsible speech. In other words, self-censorship, and that is the first stage. The second stage is government agencies or institutions such as universities issue guidelines, speech restrictive guidelines and policies. And a lot of people don't realize that we have that in our government today, and it's getting worse every year. Starting in 2008 under Bush and continuing and getting worse under Obama, unfortunately, it's a bipartisan problem. The FBI, the State Department, the National Counterterrorism Center were all issued memos discouraging their national security professionals from using words like Islamic terrorism. The national our national strategy, our national security strategy memo used to say that militant Islam was the greatest ideological threat to the 21st century, and now that's been deleted. There is absolutely no reference to anything to do with Islamic terrorism in that memo. And the DHS, Department of Homeland Security recommendations goes a step further and tells their national security professionals to focus on terrorist behavior and to, quote, de-link it from the underlying ideology that motivates it. The next step is civil violations, and Canada is a good example of that. They have a constitution that affords them free speech. Yet, in almost every province, they have a human rights commission that on a regular and frequent basis issues fines for defaming Islam, even if they haven't defamed a person. And the final step in the process is the criminalization of speech. Some of you might have followed the case of Geert Wilders. He's a member of parliament in the Netherlands, and he has very strong, outspoken views on Islam. He's been very clear that he has nothing against Muslims, just against the ideology of Islam. And while you might not agree with his views, should he be imprisoned for voicing them? Yet that was the possibility he was facing when he was criminally prosecuted while a member of parliament for merely voicing his opinion. After a long drawn-out trial, he was acquitted. Many saw this as a victory for free speech, but it was not, because the process is still in place, and the mere prosecution has a chilling effect on speech. It sends a message to everybody else that they shouldn't voice their opinion lest they face the same process and wind up with a different result. It's interesting to note that the language under which he was prosecuted in the Dutch Penal Code is very similar to the language of Resolution 1618. It was incitement to hatred language, letting you know that the language can still be manipulated. I'm going to give you a few examples of real-life consequences of how the concept of combating defamation of Islam is being put into practice today. I want to be clear, I'm not saying that these examples are the direct result of the resolution, nor even of the OIC, because there are, unfortunately, many Islamist organizations, including Muslim Brotherhood front groups, that are pushing to protect Islam from defamation using different tactics. So these examples are just examples of how that concept is being played out in real life today. First, combating defamation of Islam is having a chilling effect on speech and authorship in all quarters of life, from the workplace to the public square. You can no longer criticize Islamic persecution of religious minorities, Islamic human rights violations, or Islamic terrorism without being slapped with the label Islamophobe. In Europe, most of the countries have some kind of hate speech laws, whether they're denigration of religions, advocacy of religious hatred, public order laws, or so forth. They all serve as proxies for Islamic blasphemy codes by having deterrent penalties for insulting Islam. In America, if you have an event or a book with an author, a speaker, or a prayer leader, prayer events even, then with increasing frequency, those events or prayer events or books are getting canceled. Corporations are changing their products and their package design and even their production procedures in order to address the Islamic issue and make sure they don't defame Islam. And in some cases, due to fear of lawsuits, either real or conjured up, employers are giving special preferences to Muslims, basically exempting them from the laws under which the rest of us have to live. If this is a subject that interests you, you can Google what's going on in Minnesota with EEOC claims. The FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, the National Counterterrorism Center have all rewritten their training programs in the last year and completely deleted all mention of Islamic terrorism. There have been approximately 87 trainers who were consultants for years and years and years who used to train people on counterterrorism. But if they ever mentioned anything to do with Islamic terrorism, even if they used a qualifying phrase like radical Islam or radical Muslims or political or militant or some disclaimer, they were still considered Islamophobic, and they are no longer welcome to train on counterterrorism. In other words, our government, using your taxpayer dollars, are working hard to protect Islam from defamation at the expense of protecting you. Finally, we have the Benghazi fiasco. As we all know by now, the attacks in Benghazi were done by an Al-Qaeda affiliate, and they were terrorist attacks and not a spontaneous uprising as the administration originally claimed. So there are numerous issues with this. One of them is the cover-up of the attacks, but the other is what was the reason that scapegoating an obscure anti-Islam video was the means of the cover-up. I believe it was in order to appease the Muslim world by showing them that we're protecting Islam from defamation. If you recall, in his Cairo speech in 2009, the president said, it is, quote, "My job as President of the United States to protect negative stereotypes of Islam, not of Muslims, of Islam, wherever I find them." And that is exactly what this administration is doing. The Founding Fathers drafted the First Amendment in part to protect offensive speech. The way to counter bad speech is with good speech. Instead of working with the OIC to stifle free expression, America should be leading the charge to establish freedom of speech worldwide. Instead of allowing the OIC's ideology to influence the State Department, we should be condemning the persecution of religious minorities and the human rights violations that are committed by the OIC countries, those to whom we're currently capitulating, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. And above all, and I can't stress this enough, we have to remember that free speech constitutes a human right. Its restriction in the form of combating defamation of religions does not. The OIC is trying to assert combating defamation of religions as an international human right, but only people should be afforded human rights. Ideas, policies, and religions ought not get protection from criticism. Additionally, I want to make it clear that the constitutional concept of religious freedom bears absolutely no resemblance to the OIC's concept of combating defamation of religions. Religious freedom is an individual right. It is the right of an individual to freely practice his faith. It is not the right of a religion to be free from criticism. Resolutions like the ones I've discussed with you today harm free speech rights, they harm religious freedom rights, they harm human rights, they harm national security, and they harm terrorism prevention efforts. Yet, the OIC is continually using cries of Islamophobia to claim victimhood and gain empathy and support for its anti-freedom measures. In conclusion, I want to say that we cannot allow the OIC to take the shield of religious freedom and use it as a sword of state censorship. America is the freest country in the world and the hope of all men who are living under tyranny and oppression. We should be holding ourselves up as a role model for freedom, equal rights, and tolerance, and human rights, instead of exalting the Islamist enemies of freedom that constitute the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And I think my time is up.
Brim secondhand that at the last set of meetings there was an indication that the OIC was going to shift its policy from a focus on Islamophobia to a focus on hatred of Islam.
Right. Well, that's an analysis of what's going on. It's not mine, but I'll tell you what's happening.
Yeah,
basically, the OIC is now pushing. They had another meeting in Cairo. It wasn't an international. It wasn't this kind of conference. It was with its own countries. It was held in Cairo recently, and they're amping up their fight against Islamophobia, but they're also asking the UN, specifically the the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. I'm sorry?
OCHCR.
Isn't the OHCHR? Yeah, I think there's an H in it. But anyway, so yeah, it's the Office of the High Commissioner, and they're asking them to start a. Is it okay if I'm going to sit down?
Yeah.
My back is gonna. Can you see me over there? So they're asking the UN to start some kind of instrument that would serve as an early warning sign for discrimination against all religions. Sort of similar to their observatory, maybe an observatory in the UN that would monitor worldwide incidents of, and they do phrase it as all religions. Yes, I have heard the interpretation that that's a move away. That's obviously, we're talking about their intent and why they're doing it. All we know is that they're asking for this. What's the reason? That's one interpretation, it's not mine. I completely believe that they're doing this because look at what they do with everything else. OIC and CARE, other organizations are constantly doing a few things. First of all, they solicit complaints. So then they can use those statistics. They're always trying to show that Islamophobia is the big problem, that discrimination against Muslims is a big problem. And even with them doing all that, it pales in comparison to anti-Semitism. It's just not, they have a political investment in making Islamophobia, discrimination against Muslims, the big issue. I believe if they have an international observatory like that, they will do the same thing. They will solicit, make up, conjure up, and have more people report it, and that the real agenda, are you all going to start looking for things? Are you going to start reporting hostile glances? I don't think so. So I think what they're going to do is use it so that they have, quote, empirical evidence to show, that Islamophobia really is the big problem. That's what I think the motive is. So, and what else happened? Well, that's really it. I mean, the thing about Islamophobia is, I guess I will stand because it's like, it's really exploding. It's really when you go out, and it's not just the OIC doing it, it's all of these other organizations. ICNA is that still on?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that, I'm sorry. ICNA has had a campaign all across the country on campuses, basically trying to tell everybody there's a lot of Islamophobia and all of Islam is great. And I'm one of the people, I've had some disagreements with some people in here. Is it all Islam, part of Islam, this, that? I would encourage you not to even get into that debate. For my purposes, it's not relevant. I don't care if you want to worship a Q-tip, go ahead. I don't think most of us really care. I think it's when you want to impose your views on me, when you want me to comply with your blasphemy laws. If it's against your religion to draw a cartoon, then don't draw it. I'm not your religion. Why do I have to comply with that? So they're amping up their whole issue on Islamophobia. There are a lot of other organizations, some youth groups that are starting to go around. One of the things that they're all doing now also is trying to get Islamophobia characterized as racist. There are a lot of legal reasons to characterize it as racist because they'll have a lot more rights. It won't be as disputable. On a local level, there are some organizations trying to get the EEOC to characterize it as racist, and the OIC is trying to use some UN not resolutions, but like conventions. There are some conventions like ISER, the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. They're trying to get it amended so that it'll say, that it'll include Islamophobia, and those conventions are binding for the people, for the countries that ratified it. So those are the two things. You have to be careful when you hear your churches have interfaith dialogue. I would strongly encourage you to try to educate your pastors, your reverends, and if that doesn't help, then try to educate the other members of the congregation, because if they all start leaving, then the pastors will listen. But they are having these interfaith bullcrap seminars, excuse me, but that's what they are, where they're basically, first of all, they never define it. They work on the assumption that it's the same, and they'll start giving you examples. Oh, the Catholic discrimination isn't that terrible, and the Jewish discrimination isn't that terrible, and then they work on the assumption that what you all have a problem with is the fact that they want to worship to Allah 5 times a day in their mosque. I don't think that's it. I think the problems that most of us have issue with are the persecution. If you look at the OIC's Cairo Declaration of Islamic Human Rights, that'll tell you what they really believe. They did not want to sign the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And I've been criticized for pointing this out because there are a lot of conservatives who don't believe in that. But I'm not talking about all the phrases. I'm specifically pointing out that it is a religion-neutral doctrine that presumes people of all faiths are equal, and that people who are men and women are equal under the law. That is not what the Cairo Declaration says. It is not a religion-neutral doctrine. It believes in the supremacy of Islam. It believes in different rights for men and women. And any rights that it gives, for example, free expression or freedom of religion, are confined to what is permissible under Sharia law, which basically nullifies it. So what it gives with one hand, it takes with the other, and even though it's called the Declaration of, Cairo Declaration of Islamic Human Rights, when you read it, it really reads like a list of obligations to the religion of Islam as monitored through the state. So the word Islamophobia, by a lot of people in this country, without asking what it really is assuming it's bigotry against Muslims. And they don't understand that for the people who have a problem with all this, like me or some of you here, I recognize your faces, it's not because you care if someone has a different religion. It's because it's become a political ideology, and I think it's important for us to make that clear, that it's when it crosses over into the political and infringes on my rights, that's when there's a problem. And the second thing is, they also don't understand how the OIC and the Muslim Brotherhood front groups are defining Islamophobia. It's like if you don't have your second-class citizenry, if you're not treated, if you don't comply with their rules, then you're Islamophobic. If the EU asked Iran to drop the death penalty, that's Islamophobic. Do the people who are having these interfaith dialogues understand that they're supporting this? We have to understand what Islamophobia means. I will tell you that the OIC is master manipulators in the use of manipulating language. I'm pointing out the language of Islamophobia. But I gave a whole class at a graduate school merely on their deception techniques and the way they use, why are they using UN resolutions and multilateral platforms? Their focus for religious equality is not in their countries. Their whole focus is the West. We're the ones who are bigoted. We're the ones. So the focus is on the West. And why are they using UN resolutions? Because in the free marketplace of ideas, at least in the West, Islamist ideas would never win. So they do an end run around it and go to a bureaucratic, unelected body. So the Islamophobia is the one word I picked out, but believe me, whether it's intolerance or whether it's defamation of religions, means defamation of Islam, not defamation of I mean, I could write, they rewrote the dictionary. It's really important when you're dealing with these folks to make them define their terms and make sure you don't make assumptions and that you understand what they mean when they say something and how it would play out in practice.
Andrea, did you have a question?
I just think it's interesting because they claim that their religion, Islam is a religion.
Yeah.
So you can be a religion and a race. And it's a little bit like another topic, which I won't bring up, but it's, you know, how can you be all of these things?
Yeah. Yes, it's a little confusing. And that's, I'm sure that's part of it, is to confuse you. And, you know, that's another point from a national security point of view. I mean, I was trying to do this more from a religious point of view, but from a national security point of view, if they can get you to not say there is such a thing, you know, oh, now we're at war, we're not, and I'm not one of the people, I know some people take issue with it, I'm not one of the people that's going to say it's all Islam, because I believe that there are people, whatever you want to call them, if they're modernized, if they're this or that, but if you believe in separation of mosque and state, and you want to practice your faith within the confines of the Constitution the way everybody else does, I don't have a problem with that. But when you want to deny that any of this is going on in the name of Islam, and I'm not going to say if it's the right or wrong interpretation, you know, I don't really think it makes a difference. I think the people who have the seminars, is Islam a religion of peace, or is it, to me, and I know some of you don't agree with me, I think it's a mistake because that's what they want, is for you to get sidetracked into it. If none of you are Muslim, do you care if it's the right or wrong interpretation of a religion that you don't believe in anyway? It's not really relevant. What's important is stop flying the planes into the building, stop persecuting the Christians, stop it, and I believe that they're denying that there's an idea, that there's, how about this, there's at least one, and probably more, interpretations of Islam under which they are doing these acts. That's all. Just making the observation. They're the ones saying they're doing it for this reason. I'm not. Why are you, you know, criticizing the reporters? They're the ones calling themselves Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They're the ones calling themselves Hezbollah, Party of God, Party of Allah. They're the ones. So why? I think part of the reason that they don't want you to use this language is because they don't want you to know what's going on. It is the same countries who are telling you, don't use this language. On one hand, they're saying, don't use this language, none of it's happening. At the same time that they're propagating it even further.
I'm wondering if this perception is correct. Are they, the OIC, are they operating from a position that they should have the ability to control the conversation about Islam even outside of Islamic circles?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
That's the whole point. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Is they're trying to control how Westerners, non-Muslims, can use it. Absolutely. That is. Yes. And also, in 2014, they're going to have a new Secretary General, the guy who heads up the whole thing, and he's going to be from Egypt, which you probably know is a Muslim Brotherhood country now. According to the current Secretary General, Egypt is undergoing a renaissance, and it's great news.
Yes, yeah, you mentioned the Danish cartoons.
Yeah.
And in Nigeria, we lost over 100 people because of cartoons that were published in Denmark, in spite of the fact that Christian leaders in Nigeria spoke out and condemned the Danish cartoons.
Yeah.
So that shows that there's literally nothing we can do to change the fact that they're looking for an excuse to attack.
Correct.
Even very recently, 3 months ago, we had a situation where a tailor was speaking about a fashion, and he couldn't speak Hausa well, he mispronounced it. A riot broke out, Christians were killed, and a church was burnt. I call that the ultimate fashion mistake because it resulted in deaths.
Right.
But I say this to say, what mechanism can we institute to counter this? Because Muslims have told us in Nigeria that the mistake you Christians make is we take the initiative and then you come back afterwards and react.
Say that again, that last part. They
That
said what?
They take the initiative. Yes, Christians are constantly on the reactionary side because they always take the lead. If you saw Hayan Hissi's piece in Newsweek last year, she called it Christianophobia.
Yeah.
But they're way ahead of us because they've created Islamophobia, so we're playing catch-up when really we are the ones who should be driving this issue. So what institutions, what mechanisms can we introduce to ensure that this massive killings under the pretext of,
I mean, are you saying in
blasphemy?
Nigeria or in America? 'Cause
I mean, this is now a global phenomenon.
yeah. Well, I mean, at least in America, I mean, since I'm more focused on that, I'm more... Listen, I've had people come to me and say, how can we make the Muslims change their mind? I'm like, have you been married? I mean, it's hard to change somebody else. You can't change one person. You're not going to change all these people. But I think what you can do something about is don't let them change you. Why don't we start there? Let's focus on who we are. We stand for freedom. We do stand for equality. And don't capitulate. You give them an inch, they want a mile. Do not apologize. Do not capitulate. Do not accommodate them. I think it emboldens them. It's a message to them that they're winning. They have the OIC has a 10-year plan to combat Islamophobia, and it has techniques of incrementalism in order to achieve it. Every time, we're operating from a completely different mindset. They haven't changed who they are. They haven't changed their goals. You say you want to compromise, we're just going one step further to where they are. We need to explain to them why free speech is important. I'll give you an example that's somewhat controversial. I don't feel ambivalent about it, but say in the military, when some people burned the Quran, although I've heard it's not really a Quran because it was already defaced. But putting that aside, our military apologized, condemned it, and on and on and on. Now, I personally don't burn books of any kind. It's not my thing. I don't really believe in it. But you know what? It is a freedom under the First Amendment in this country. If it's a First Amendment right to burn the flag, the American flag, it's the First Amendment right to burn the Quran. Do I condone it? Do I condone it? Do I agree with it? No, I do not. But I think what the military should have done was to say, we don't agree with it and we don't condone it, but this is why we have this freedom in this country. And then go on to explain the bigger picture and the context of why putting up with some bad speech is worth, I don't even know if I want to use that as an example, but putting up with, bad speech and being offended sometimes is worth it for the greater freedom and the greater good down the road. So I think we have to cling to the purpose of freedom and how being offended now and then, have people disagree with you, is part of true tolerance. Because what they want, when they say tolerance, is capitulation and compliance with their rules. The comment that they're always making, which is Islamophobia is one of the greatest threats to world security and stability. I mean, people say bad things all the time, and it's not just on religion, it's on everything. So it's only a great threat to world peace when they choose to respond to every little cartoon and every little comment they don't like with violence. That's why it's a threat. And they're trying to, that's the whole point. If they can connect the speech to the violence and create that association in your mind and then make the argument for the fact that this speech causes violence, then that's ammunition for them to stamp out the speech. And I think we have to disconnect it and put the responsibility where it falls. No, they knew it, or I know this one woman and they're not answering me. And I said, you have it all wrong. Your audience isn't that panel who's going to think what they're going to think and say, your audience is the audience, a lot of whom came because they really don't know anything about it. They don't know anything about it, and they're open-minded and interested. And if you sound like that, I can tell you, even I was sitting there thinking, wow, they're not going to say, oh yeah, everything you're saying is right. They're just going to say, what's wrong with you, you angry lunatic? So I think it's really important to stress, my opinion is whether you believe it or not, it's important to stress that you respect, people who want to have their private faith, and that you have legitimate concerns, and that you want to be able to raise legitimate concerns about persecution of Christians, about Islamic terrorism, without being slapped with the label Islamophobe? Why can't you even ask the question? Can't we have an honest discussion about it? I believe there's such a thing as and by the way, the OIC denies that there's any religious persecution in the Muslim countries. Okay, so while Iran is holding Pastor Saeed in jail as I speak, right, for the crime of apostasy. So I think it's really important to watch your tone and realize who you're talking to, and just raise a question. Shouldn't we be allowed to have a discussion about this? You know, counter it, whether it's an interfaith dialogue or the schools. I think, and again, I don't have the car, but I think somebody should go to Georgetown, and you can't really interrupt the class, but on their way out, give out flyers for a competing class or a competing seminar or even a little fact sheet. So whenever they're having it, just don't let them get away with it and not even have it questioned or countered. I think that would be a good start. And to try to label it, and also to expose those groups, you know, ISNA, CARE, like whoever they are. If you can go to their seminars and hear some of the stuff from the horses and expose who they really are. They'll hold themselves out as one thing, and they're really another. They'll say one thing to one audience and another thing to another. Or they'll say one thing while they're doing exactly what they're telling you doesn't occur. So.
This has been great, Deborah. Desi and I had the pleasure of attending the last day of the summit that Hillary had last year. And one of the things that was interesting was that there were people there that didn't know why they were there. And this a Central and South American, we'll leave it at that. She and I both spoke to these individuals. No real Muslims in their country, no problem with Islamophobia, and that goes to the point that she's made, that they are co-opting people of other countries that you would think are completely unrelated and uninvolved. They're getting everyone involved, getting everyone to buy in. We went into a room and they were all the place cards around for the countries, and that's the problem. There's not enough challenging. We're focused, yes, on America, but Central and South American countries are buying in and giving support as well.
And it's harder in Europe because they've already signed on to some of the conventions where they have the hate speech language. So the other thing the OIC is doing now is they're trying to come up with even more legal instruments that they can use to achieve their goal. And one of the things they do is they use language from pre-existing legal instruments that countries have already signed off on and might change it a little or try to apply it in a way, and then it's harder to say no because people will say, well, you know, we signed it before. But the OIC Secretary General's definition of Islamophobia, just so you know, is, quote, any anti-Islam or anti-Muslim attitude or activity, unquote. That's a quote from a Turkish paper. So you see, when he says it, he's not talking about just violence or just discrimination, and he's not even just talking about speech, but any thought or attitude as well. And the OIC's goal is to eradicate all manifestations of Islamophobia.